Ladies and gentlemen, gather round, and let me tell you a story not of a hero who sought glory, but of a legend who ran from it. This is the complete life story of the man known as the Crimson Catalyst, the Fallen Prodigy, Christopher Reed. Picture the classic anime opener. A young man with hair like silver and eyes blazing with fiery potential, standing atop a mountain of S-rank achievements. Christopher Reed wasn't just strong, he was a natural disaster in human form. His power, Mana Overdrive, didn't just defeat monsters, it erased them from existence in a beautiful, terrifying cascade of crimson light. He was the star, the unbeatable, the future. The story of Christopher Reed begins not in the fiery crucible of battle, but in the haunting, silent aftermath. To understand the man he became, we must first understand the ghost he chose to be, and that requires a deep dive into the ruins of his former glory. He wasn't just any S-rank, he was a prodigy, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and trepidation. They called him the Crimson Catalyst, and his power, Mana Overdrive, was a spectacle to behold. Imagine a young man, not yet hardened by the world's cruelties, with hair the color of spun moonlight and eyes that held the contained energy of a nascent star. When he fought, it wasn't a brawl, it was a symphony of pure, destructive beauty. Crimson energy didn't just emanate from him, it lived with him, swirling around his form like a loyal phoenix, responding to his every thought with terrifying immediacy. Gates would tremble at his presence. Monsters, moments from breaching the human world, would instinctively recoil, their primal senses screaming of an apex predator. He was the Hunter Association's golden boy, the one featured on magazines and news broadcasts, the living embodiment of humanity's hope against the dungeon scourge. His rise was meteoric, a classic shonen protagonist dream. He didn't climb the ranks, he vaporized them. While other hunters relied on teams, strategy, and complementary abilities, Christopher was a one-man army. His method was simple, brutal, and breathtakingly effective. Locate the dungeon's core, channel the overdrive, and unleash a wave of annihilating light. There was no finesse, no subtlety, only the overwhelming and absolute proof of power. He was the solution to every problem, the hammer for which every dungeon was a nail. The public adored him, the association funded him, younger hunters idolized him. He stood atop the world, bathed in that brilliant crimson light, believing it was his destiny to cleanse the earth of its monstrous invaders. This was his prologue, arc, the dazzling opening sequence of the anime where the hero seems invincible, and the future is painted in the vibrant, untroubled colors of certain victory. But the most compelling Korean anime narratives are built on the foundation that absolute power is never a simple gift, it is a covenant with catastrophe. The very nature of Mana Overdrive was a double-edged sword, a fact the association's scientists whispered about in worried tones but never dared to speak aloud to their star player. It wasn't just about drawing mana from the world, it was about catalyzing it, forcing a fundamental change in its state that released energy on an exponential scale. The problem was control. The energy, once unleashed, craved more fuel. It was a self-perpetuating reaction, and Christopher's will was the only dam holding back an infinite tide. He was not a master of the power, he was its conductor, and one wrong move, one moment of emotional spike or physical faltering, and the symphony would become a cacophony of destruction. The turning point, the canon event, that shattered his world, was the raid on the Echoing Chasm, a newly emerged S-rank gate that pulsed with an alien, dissonant mana signature unlike anything recorded before. The mission was straightforward, penetration and annihilation. Christopher's team, Aegis Prime, was the best of the best. There was Valeriana, the stoic tank whose barriers were considered unbreakable, Jin-Ho, the lightning-fast scout with a witty remark for every near-death experience, and Dr. Aris, the strategist and healer who kept their spirits and bodies intact. They were more than a team, they were a family, and Christopher was their proud, if sometimes reckless, older brother. The descent into the chasm was a visual masterpiece of ominous beauty, crystalline structures that hummed with latent energy, shadows that moved against the light, and a deep, thrumming sound that felt like the heartbeat of the world itself. They reached the core chamber, a vast, cavernous space where the boss, a being of shifting shadows and piercing light known as the Dissonance Weaver, awaited. The battle was epic, a true saga-filled episode. Valeriana's shields flared under devastating psychic assaults, Jin-Ho was a blur of motion drawing aggro, and Dr. Aris's healing orbs flew like fireflies. And Christopher, he was the centerpiece, a maelstrom of crimson energy, trading cataclysmic blows with the Weaver. But the Weaver's power was insidious, it didn't just attack the body, it attacked the mind, projecting illusions and amplifying emotional turmoil. In the heat of the battle, a misdirection from the Weaver made it appear that Jin-Ho had been struck down. A spike of pure, unadulterated panic and rage, a brother's fear, lanced through Christopher's heart. That was all it took. A single crack in the dam of his concentration. The mana overdrive, sensing the falter of its conductor, broke its leash. It was no longer a directed attack, it was an eruption. The crimson light, usually so beautiful, became a ravenous, indiscriminate void. It didn't target the Weaver, it targeted everything. The screen wouldn't show a heroic final blow, but a blinding, white-out static of pure energy, followed by an absolute, deafening silence. When the light faded, the animation would shift to a shaky, grainy filter. The dissonance Weaver was gone, disintegrated. But so was Valeriana's unbreakable shield. So was Jin-Ho's incredible speed. So was Dr. Aris's healing light. The entire core chamber, and the dungeon gate itself, had been unmade. Christopher stood alone, kneeling in a sphere of glassed earth, the only remnant of a world he had just erased. His power hadn't just defeated the enemy, it had consumed his friends, his family, his very reason for fighting. This was the birth of the Fallen Prodigy. The public narrative was carefully managed by the association, a tragic loss, a noble sacrifice. But within the halls of power, he was now a failed weapon, a liability. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than any monster he had ever slain. The cheers of the crowd felt like accusations. The crimson light that once defined him now only reminded him of the blood on his hands. And so, Christopher Reed, the once golden hero, made a choice. He walked away. He erased his identity, used his remaining wealth and knowledge to weave powerful concealment runes around a small, forgotten antique shop on the outskirts of the city, and became a ghost. The man who once commanded the attention of nations now preferred the silence of dust and old memories. He was a living monument to his own failure, a master-level character who had voluntarily exiled himself to the starter village, forever haunted by the devastating cost of the very power that had once made him a legend. The world, of course, did not stop turning simply because one of its former champions had retired to a life of quiet penance. While Christopher Reed buried himself in the comforting monotony of dusting relics and appraising low-tier mana crystals, a new, more insidious threat was bubbling up from the Earth's foundations. It wasn't a grand, towering dungeon gate of the old style, it was something far more unstable and unpredictable, a spatial rift. Designated Tempest Fracture, it didn't just appear, it flickered into existence in the industrial district, a jagged scar in reality itself that pulsed with chaotic energy, tearing at the very fabric of the city around it. Conventional S-rank hunters, masters of brute force and elemental power, found their abilities useless. Their strongest attacks were either absorbed by the rift or, worse, reflected back with amplified fury. This wasn't a monster to be slain, it was a wound in the world that needed to be sutured, and the association was bleeding resources trying to contain it. Enter the new generation, a fresh-faced squad from the Hunter Academy, their uniforms still crisp, their eyes alight with the untarnished zeal of those who had only ever faced simulated threats in training halls. Their leader was Kato, a bright-eyed young man with a potent but unrefined lightning affinity, brimming with the kind of textbook courage that has never been truly tested. With him was Maya, a barrier specialist who could quote tactical manuals verbatim but had never felt a real monster's blow shudder through her defenses, and Leo, a brawny close combat fighter whose strength was undeniable but whose recklessness was a ticking time bomb. They were the perfect archetypes of a rookie team, sent on what was supposed to be a simple perimeter containment mission, a safe, first assignment to observe a real-world phenomenon. They were, in every sense, the side characters in their own story, about to stumble into the narrative of a forgotten legend. Disaster struck with the unpredictable violence of the fracture itself. The rift convulsed, emitting a pulse of distorted gravity that shattered the association's containment field and warped the city blocks around it. In an instant, the rookie's orderly perimeter became a chaotic battlefield. Kato's lightning bolts arced wildly, scorching the ground but doing nothing to the shimmering tear in space. Maya's barriers, so effective against training drones, splintered under the raw spatial pressure. Leo, charging forward with heroic intent, found his fists passing uselessly through the anomaly, nearly getting his arm severed by a shard of displaced reality. They were out of their depth, panicked, and about to be erased by a force they couldn't even comprehend, their textbook strategies as useful as a paper shield. It was this cacophony of failure that finally pierced the soundproofing of Christopher Reed's self-imposed exile. The tremor of the pulse rattled the cups in his shop. He didn't need a news report, he could feel the wrongness in the air, a familiar, sickening taste of unraveling reality. A part of him, the part that was still the fallen hero, screamed to stay hidden, to let the association handle it. But through his window, he saw it, not the rift itself, but the terrified faces of the young hunters. He saw Kato's desperate, futile attacks, the mirror image of his own youthful arrogance. He saw Maya's barrier shatter, a haunting echo of Valeriana's final stand. He wasn't just seeing rookies in trouble, he was watching ghosts from his past about to be slaughtered, and the dam of his inaction broke. His emergence was not a heroic leap. It was a weary, reluctant walk. He didn't burst from his shop in a blaze of crimson light, he simply opened the door, his posture slumped, an old man annoyed at being disturbed. But the moment he stepped onto the fractured street, the animation style shifted. The world seemed to slow, the camera focusing on the dust motes dancing around his worn boots. He didn't look at the terrifying rift, he looked at the panicked children. And when he spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly roll that cut through the chaos with the weight of hard-earned experience. "Stop," he commanded, not with anger, but with an absolute, undeniable authority. "You're not fighting an enemy. You're trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it." In that moment, the legendary hunter was gone, replaced by the gruff, unwilling mentor. He saw in them not just doomed rookies, but a chance, a tiny, fragile chance, to atone. If he could not save his old team, perhaps he could forge this new one into something that would survive. He would teach them the one lesson he had learned at the cost of everything, that true power wasn't about unleashing hell, but about controlling the battlefield, and more importantly, controlling oneself. The core of Christopher Reed's journey was never about acquiring more power. He had, in his youth, already touched the sun and been catastrophically burned. His return to the battlefield was not a quest to rekindle that old, destructive flame, but a desperate mission to master the embers that still smoldered within him. The concept of the power of sacrifice, not strength, became the brutal, defining philosophy of his second act. While the rookie hunters, Kato and his team, were obsessed with leveling up, increasing their mana reserves, and unlocking new flashy techniques, the classic shonen progression, Christopher understood a darker, more fundamental truth. True power, the kind that endures and protects, is often not about how much you can unleash, but how much you can willingly give up. His ultimate ability, the one he had theorized but was too terrified to ever attempt after the Echoing Chasm, was not an attack. He called it Crimson Coffin. It was the absolute antithesis of Mana Overdrive. Where Overdrive was a chaotic, exponential explosion, the Coffin was an implosion of perfect control. It was a technique of ultimate containment. The principle was horrifyingly simple. Instead of catalyzing mana to release energy, he would use his own body as a living catalyst to absorb it. He would draw a target, be it a monster, a spatial rift, or a runaway spell, into a field of intensified crimson energy and then, through an act of unimaginable will, collapse the field in on itself. He would become a living prison, sealing the threat within the confines of his own being. The cost, however, was absolute. The strain of containing such immense, volatile power would systematically shred his own mana channels, cripple his body, and could very easily consume his consciousness entirely, leaving him an empty, broken husk. It was a suicide technique, a final, desperate measure he carried like a cursed seal, the knowledge of it a constant, heavy weight on his soul. This internal conflict is where the most relatable and poignant anime themes shine through. Christopher was not a fearless hero, he was a man paralyzed by the memory of his failure and terrified of the only tool he had left to prevent another. Every time he guided Kato to control his lightning rather than simply amplify it, or taught Maya to reinforce the structural integrity of her barriers at the cost of their size, he was preaching the lessons he himself had failed to learn. He was teaching them the power of efficiency, of precision, of sacrifice. "A smaller, stronger shield will save your life," he'd grunt at Maya. "A giant, flashy one will just give the enemy a bigger target." He was trying to forge them into hunters who would never have to make the choice he was preparing to make. The climax of this arc arrived when the Tempest fracture, destabilized by the rookies' earlier attempts to fight it, began to expand uncontrollably. Standard S ranks were powerless, their massive attacks only fed the anomaly. Evacuations were failing. The city was moments from being folded into a singularity of chaotic energy. In that moment, Christopher faced his ultimate choice. He could attempt one last, glorious overdrive, a final blaze of glory that would likely fail and accelerate the end. Or, he could use the technique he had feared his entire life. He looked at Kato's determined, soot-stained face, at Maya's trembling but resolute hands holding a failing barrier to protect civilians, and he saw the future he had failed to protect once before. This time, the sacrifice would be his alone. With a calm that was more terrifying than any battle cry, he stepped forward. The animation would slow, the sound dying away to a faint hum. Crimson energy, usually so wild, began to flow inward, wrapping around him not in a fiery aura, but in complex, sealing runes that burned themselves into his skin. He wasn't generating power, he was becoming a vacuum. He was sacrificing his strength, his future, his very self, not to destroy, but to protect. It was the ultimate expression of a hero, not the one who wins the fight, but the one who ends it by ensuring no one else has to. The legacy of a hero is not written in the moments of their greatest power, but in the silence that follows their greatest sacrifice. For Christopher Reid, the man who once blazed across the sky like a crimson comet, his final and most defining act was not an explosion, but an embrace. The activation of the crimson coffin was the antithesis of everything he had once been. As the chaotic energy of the Tempest fracture surged, he did not meet it with a greater, more violent force. Instead, he opened himself to it. The animation in this pivotal scene would be a masterpiece of poignant contrast. Where the rift was a screaming, violent tear of purple and black lightning, Christopher became a focal point of serene, deep crimson light. The wild energy did not vaporize, it was drawn into him, pulled into the gravitational well of his sacrifice. He did not destroy the threat, he made his own body its tomb. The light did not flash outwards, but inwards, collapsing until it was contained within the outline of his form, which glowed for a single, breathtaking moment before the light faded, leaving him kneeling on the ground, pale and hollowed, but alive. The rift was gone. The city was saved. In the aftermath, Christopher was not the same. The power that had once defined him was now a sealed, dormant poison within his veins. He was physically weaker, his legendary S-ranked status a hollow echo. But in sacrificing the source of his strength, he found his true purpose. He became a human shield, in a new, profound way. No longer the unbreakable wall of force, he became a living lesson. He returned to his shop, but now his door was open to the new generation. Kato, Maya, and Leo, forever changed by his sacrifice, became his first and most dedicated students. He did not teach them how to become unstoppable forces, he taught them how to become immovable objects. He taught them how to read a mana flow to de-escalate a conflict, how to build a defense that could outlast any offense, and, most importantly, he taught them the weight of the power they wielded. His legacy became one of wisdom, not wreckage. This new wave of hunters, inspired by the Crimson Guardian, as he was now known, began to shift the very culture of the Hunter Association. The old, glory-seeking mentality began to give way to a new ethos centered on containment, protection, and minimal collateral damage. Christopher's story, from a devastating failure to a redemptive sacrifice, became a foundational text in the Academy. He was not held up as a perfect, infallible idol, but as a complex, relatable testament to the fact that a hunter's greatest weapon is their conscience. The final scenes of his story would not show him standing triumphant over a vanquished foe, but sitting quietly in his shop, a faint, peaceful smile on his face as he watches his students, the true inheritors of his legacy, train in the courtyard. They are stronger, smarter, and more compassionate because of his journey. The man who was once a beacon of terrifying light had become the steady, guiding flame that lit the way for others, proving that a legacy forged in the quiet, selfless light of protection shines infinitely longer and brighter than one cast in the violent, fleeting shadow of destruction.